actually yes. It seems to be the same. So this is an example how brain imaging data can be informative for theoretical cognitive models. Although a slight word of caution may be advisable here, because some rather strict cognitive psychologists would say you never can inform cognitive models by brain imaging data, because there are ways to explain that you have two different cognitive processes while you still have the same activation. For instance, you may argue, well, you have such a broad area activated, maybe the exact type of operation is different. It is in the area, but in one task it's working in that way, and in the other task it's working in that way. So that you have different cognitive operations while having the same activation. But in the area of, let's say, cognitive neuroscience, most people nowadays would at least tentatively subscribe to such inferences. So that you use MRI to make inferences in cognitive models. Okay, let's turn to the next task switching. And the first task switching study which has been done was by Drösel nearly 100 years ago. And these times, people didn't have computers, so what they used were just paper and pencil. And what he had were 3 lists of just numbers. And on the first list, he had participants just add 3 to each number. So 15 plus 3, 18. 12 plus 3, 15. 8 plus 3, 11, and so forth. And he measured the time it took them to complete the whole list. Then he had a sheet of paper and asked them, with the numbers, just please subtract 3 from each number. So 27 minus 3 is 24. 75 minus 3 is 72, and so forth. And then he had a list where people had to switch between the 2 operations. So add 3 on the first, 18 plus 3, 21. Subtract 3 on the second, so 24 minus 3, 21. Add 3, so 38. Subtract 3, 62, and so forth. And he took the time, and then he compared the time and found when you have to alternate, you are slower. And he quantified that by the so-called task switching costs, and that is the time to do the mixed list minus the average time of the other 2 lists. And he was able to show that these are quite fundamental. Then the paradigm hadn't been used for half a century or something, or even more, and in the early 90s, first by Alan Allport, and later then picked up by Rogers and Mansell, it became popular again. So in the early 90s, a real big run of the task switching paradigm started. And one reason was presumably that at this time as well an increased interest in the executive control functions. And generally this task management operations was noticeable. And Rogers and Mansell modified the paradigm, and it's called the alternate choice paradigm. And this is a computer-based paradigm. And it looks like that. You have a configuration on the screen which has 4 squares or 4 quadrants. And then you have in one square a letter and a number. And you have 2 tasks. Task 1 is to decide whether the letter is a consonant or a vowel. And the second task is to decide whether the number is odd or even. And if the stimulus is shown above the midline, you have to do one task. If it's shown below the midline, you have to do the other task. And then the stimuli just wander from quadrant to quadrant. So here is it, let's say, consonant or vowel, here uneven or even, uneven or even, consonant or vowel, consonant or vowel. So what you have basically is a task switch, task repetition, task switch, task repetition, task switch, task repetition. from trial to trial. And then you calculate the task switch cost by subtracting the response times to switch trials from the repetition trials. And there are many, many different variants. We will see one other later, how to do that task switching paradigm. So how do people explain these task switching costs? And there are a number of accounts what these costs are due, and two just exemplary accounts are, one is called task set inertia, and that means basically the old task set lingers on. So you just have done the odd-even task, you just can't turn it off from one try to the next. It just slowly decays, and therefore in the current trial you suffer from interference from the last trial, so you have to put active inhibition in that and shield the current task from interference. So that costs time. Another explanation is insufficient preparation, and already in the alternating runs paradigm, the participant will know what the next task is because it's in such a regular rhythm. And people have taken that a step further by using an explicit pre-cue. So like in the Stroop task, you get a cue. You will do the odd-even task or the consonant-vowel task. And then they get something between no time to prepare or up to 1.5 seconds to prepare for that task. But no matter how much time you give them to prepare, there's still some residual task switching costs. And so proponents of this approach of explanation say, well, you need the actual stimulus to do the final preparation, the final implementation of the task set. To do that, you need the stimulus to be on the screen. This can't be prepared. Okay, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but just to give you some idea of the models, how to explain that. And how the executive functions are involved, or how are executive functions involved in task switching? Well, that's pretty obvious. Switching is one of the core executive functions, and in task switching you constantly switch between task sets. And you may well have to inhibit the old task set, and inhibition is a primary executive function as well. So, when you do that in the MRI, then you will see the following. I'm sorry for the quality of that figure, but that's actually how it is in the PDF from the publisher. So there is no better way. And this is one of the earliest study which, that's why I picked that, which used a very good design, a so-called event-related design, to really pinpoint the activation down. And this is the lateral view on the brain, a sagittal slice, and you may see or may not see, I will tell you, this is a lateral prefrontal cortex. Activated stronger in switch trials as compared to repetition trials. And this is the profile of activation in this area after a switch on repetition trial. Green here is repetition, and this is a switch trial, so we have higher activity. Still, what is quite interesting is that this area is not only involved in switching, but also when you repeat the old trial. So in this task switching paradigm, there seems to be a general level of requirement for task coordination, even if you do the same trial as the trial before. However, demands are increased when you have to switch. So again, lateral prefrontal cortex in the area of higher executive control, of task management, and is activated in task switching. I would like to present another task switching study which highlights some nice features of imaging research. And these authors used the following paradigm. So you read that time-wise from the top to bottom. So you have a cue which tells you which task to do, and this can be a diamond, and I think the other one was a square, just by rotation of this shape. Then, after some preparation time, which can be variable, you get your target, and this is a number, just a number, I think between 20 and 40, and one task is either to decide is it smaller or larger than 30, or is it an odd or even number. And then you have to respond as fast as possible. So here you have preparation. So you can prepare as good as possible, and then the task comes. And here you have trials where there's no preparation. So just with onset of the target, you get the information what task to do. Before that, you don't know. And the authors were interested, basically, the idea is when I have to switch tasks, I have to reset, reconfigure the task sets. I have to switch from one task to the other. When I get the cue here, I can prepare. Are these preparatory processes basically the same processes as they were here when I reconfigured, just earlier in time? Or are they different processes? Are there different areas involved in preparation? So, to find that out, they added another condition. And that is a cue-only condition. So they present the cue, wait, participant is expecting the target stimulus to appear, but it doesn't. So there's no task for the participant. Task trial goes by, and the next trial starts. If you do it in a normal behavioral lab, this condition, of course, doesn't make any sense, because you don't record any behavior. However, in the fMRI, you can record the response to the cue without any contamination of the response to the target. Because these cue intervals are at longest 1.6 seconds. As I said, the response in fMRI is quite sluggish. The blood response we measure is up to 6 seconds. So this basically all is one big response when you do that. You can't really disentangle that. So this is a nice way to assess what happens in response to preparation to a task when I expect that. Okay. And then they had what is called null events, trials where nothing happened, and they serve as a baseline to compare to. Okay, what are the results? And these are the cue-only trials versus the null events. That means this is activation which is solely due to preparation, but there's no over-behavior. And you can see that it's again the left lateral prefrontal cortex activated in a quite posterior way, close to the precentral sulcus, very close to the premotor cortex, but still. And this is compared to the null events, so to the baseline activity. What was interesting as well is that the author correlated the strength of this activation in each individual with the strength of the cueing effect. The cueing effect is how well do people prepare from the advanced cue or benefit. So let's say if you don't get a cue, you just get the number and the information which task to do at the same time. You take 1 second to respond. Now when I present the cue in advance and tell you which task to come, and then your response time may be reduced to 800 milliseconds. So you have a cueing effect of 200 milliseconds. You're faster by 200 milliseconds just because. And some people benefit from that more than others. Some people will then gain only 50 milliseconds. Others maybe 400 milliseconds by this advanced knowledge. And this graph shows the more you gain, the higher the activation. So in a way, the more juice people put in here, the more effort that people put into preparation, the higher the activation and the stronger the behavioral benefit. So there's a correlation. So another nice illustration of how MRI or imaging can be used to understand cognitive models better and what happens in these type of tasks. Now, I would like to use this as an additional note. And there's something peculiar about the task switching paradigm. And that is that these switch costs are only observed when there is some ambiguity either in the response set and or stimulus set. I will explain in a moment what that means. So in the original Jersey study, people got such a list of numbers and were required to add 3, subtract 3, add 3, and so forth. And then you observe switch costs. Do that, and it disappears. Just add the direct task. When you do the Rogers and Marcel study, they had it like that. So on every single try, you get both stimuli. In theory, there would speak nothing against saying, okay, here you get only the letters, because up here you only have to do the letter task, and down here you only get, here the letters and here the numbers, number tasks. But then you don't have task switch costs when you do the task like that. So the costs arise only when you have the ambiguous stimulus. Then in another way of putting that, with what you see, you could do both tasks. If you clarify, disambiguate the situation in a way so that you actually can do only one task, you don't have switch costs, or at least extremely small. And the same holds in a way for this study by Grass and colleagues. He also had such an ambiguous stimulus, one number and 2 tasks associated with that. So, given that constraint, one may wonder, is there any real-life situation you could think of where you have that situation that you have to switch between tasks which are so ambiguous? And I once heard how Nashon Myran talked about this, and he was quite active for a couple of years in this task switching research. And although he was involved in that type of research for years, he only was able to come up with a single example. And he lives in Israel, and he said when you have to switch keyboard, because their keyboards all have 2 letters on them, one Latin letter and one Hebrew letter. And they can switch a keyboard depending on what language they want to write. And that is a true case of task switching, because every response is at the same time associated with 2 different tasks, writing in Hebrew or writing in English, for instance. So, but it's really hard to find any more examples. So, and this is somewhat surprising that despite this total lack of relation to everyday life, task switching is extremely popular. So it has been faded down a bit, but for a couple of years it was like nearly every year tens or hundreds of papers came out, literally. So when you look for task switching in Google Scholar, you will find 20,000 results. So there are loads of papers. There is by Stephen Monsell from Exeter University, there's a Trends in Cognitive Science review paper which has been cited more than 1,000 times. This demonstrates how active this community is, how they pick that up. And one reason probably is, although you have only little relation to everyday life, it is intriguing to people that our cognitive system seems to have such a profound limitation. And that often interests investigators. So researchers often do not look for the good, normal, smoothly operating system, but they look at, okay, where are the limits of our cognitive system? So where is failure? Where are costs? Which can't we do anymore? And task switching is such an example. So these boundary conditions are used to investigate our system. So suppose you do the other task where there are no task switch costs. Well, you would do one study would show, okay, there is no task switch cost, and that's it. You couldn't do anything more to that. But when you have task switch costs, you have hundreds of questions arising from that. In which situations? What's the reason for that? So you do studies and changing parameters, people did triple switches, people did, so you have 3 tasks to switch between, people looked at much longer sequences, how does the task you did 2 trials, 3 trials ago, 4 trials ago affect your current performance, and all things like that, broad interpretation of other paradigms like negative priming into consideration. And so at some stage I would say the research got a little bit lost by itself. And that sometimes happens, that you get a research community and they're just researching the paradigm with a bit of losing the relationship to the bigger picture. And I think for some people in that domain it happened probably. Not most of them, but some really had experiments where it was really nearly impossible to follow anymore what they were doing because they were so complicated set up.
When you task switching, when you're doing things like, I don't know, flying or driving, you're switching between different choices within that. It just seems to be that it's more natural to kind of group things, because when you did the +3, -3, if I was asked to do that, I'd automatically go to each, skip one, do all those, and then come back.
Yeah. That's true. So when you are allowed to reschedule your task, then you may do that. But probably because it is somewhat difficult to switch.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. That's the natural. So you don't do something that's extra hard.
And I mean, it's a bit tricky generally to find the relation between these very simplified cognitive paradigms and everyday life paradigms. So I will a little bit later talk about dual task stuff as well, and what is understood with dual task in cognitive psychology and in everyday life is quite a bit of a difference. And in like in office work, where you have to switch between writing an email, taking a phone call, and then continue writing the email and things like that. Their task switching may be interruptive and may lower your performance, but in a different way as compared to this paradigm. For instance, in this everyday task switching, you often have limitations due to memory. When you are in the middle of writing an email and then you're interrupted by a phone call and then you return to your email, you just have lost the thought you had, you have lost the context, so you have to reread a couple of sentences and say, okay, now I can continue. So you have costs of task switching, but they are related to a different thing. They're not related to this incapability of switching without costs. I mean, these switching costs you wouldn't notice in everyday life. They are 100 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, and so on. So it's a really very brief time of interest to understand the cognitive system, but not that much of interest to everyday life, because if it would be everything, if a phone call during your email would slow down your performance by 100 milliseconds, nobody would care. But in everyday life, there is more to that.
Whether it varies with people who are doing fast task switching, like emergency services and things like that?
I don't know. There is recently quite a bit of research in how well you can train these type of executive functions. There's a lot of studies now coming out, people who did a lot of computer games show improved visual attention and things like that. There's a lot of research in dual tasking, doing 2 things at the same time, that you can train that and you improve. But with respect to these paradigms, usually what training shows is you can reduce the effect, but you cannot abolish them completely. So because by training everything gets faster, but the same, the underlying,
Fault in the system kind of thing.
so, yeah, that stays.
Yeah.
It's just less evident because
Yeah.
everything became faster.
Yeah.
So, and in general, in everyday life, I think, yes, people can train to switch between tasks on a broader level. And some may be naturally better than others.
And you think you can use this in like Arabic language? They have to switch obviously when they read, for example, we read from the left to right, they read from
Yeah, maybe that would be another example of where task switching exists. So,
bilingual.
Yeah, bilingual
Yeah.
people who can
They-
swap between
yeah.
two simultaneously.
that, I'm not quite sure, but that may be something different.
Yeah.
Because truly bilingual people, the language is so automatic that you wouldn't expect task switching costs, because you switch between two fully automatized tasks. So it doesn't involve any attentional effort anymore. These task switching paradigms, although very basic, still are not automatic. You have to do a choice response task on every trial. And I'm not quite sure whether task switching works with, for instance, simple responses. I just can't think of how you could switch between two simple response tasks, because you always have to respond to a button only, so it's not really possible. But, for dual task performance, for instance, I will show that later, that makes a big difference whether the tasks can be done automatic or whether you need attention towards them. So it's like listening to music, that's pretty much automatic. You can easily walk while listening to music, two automatic actions.
Well, with language, with bilingual people, I would argue that it's okay with children, it can be automatic because they can quickly learn and switch. But if people start learning language at certain age,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not that automatic, and then they
Yeah.
have to
Or
make
translators
choices.
who are actually
of
listening to
the-
one
Yeah,
language
yeah.
and
And there
speaking
is-
the other.
and
There is
switching
quite a bit
that.
of research on coming from the language domain, which investigates learning a second language and true bilingualism and switching back and forth. And I don't know the results of that research, but there are things like that. They investigate how fast is it to switch back and forth. Is it faster to switch to your second language or switch back to your first language? How strong are the interference effects from one language to the other? So there is quite a lot of research on that area, but I'm not quite sure, just not familiar with the research, so I couldn't say how that translates into this task switching paradigms. Okay, so while we are at this, maybe one other experience, let's say, which may be useful if you stay in the area of academia, and that was when I did my PhD. A colleague of mine started his PhD as well, and he used a very well-known paradigm, the Posner queuing paradigm, where you basically have to look and you get a cue blinking up, and then you have to do a saccade to that, or you have to identify stimulus coming up later. So you're queuing. There are different variants of that, and he used one of these variants, I can't remember which, and there are literally hundreds of papers showing that task. It's been first shown, I think, in the 70s or something. And he did the study and didn't find an effect. No queuing effect. I was surprised and tried around, tried this, tried that. And at that time, a guest researcher visited our institute who had worked with this paradigm as well. And so he asked him, he said, can you have a look at my paradigm? It doesn't work. And he said, yeah, it's basically fine. You have to just tweak and tune a bit. And what came out was basically that this Posner paradigm, or this specific variant, actually is not that easy to create. You see there are hundreds of papers, but you usually don't see all the attempts which failed to create the effect, and maybe the amount of effort behind that to create that. So that after a couple of more attempts, he had fine-tuned the presentation times and everything, and the exact distance from the fixation cross and size of the target in a way that it actually worked. So what I wanted to say is, don't be misled by the fact that there are loads of papers in a certain paradigm. It still can be a very fragile thing to create, to get. Same thing kind of happened to me. I worked with visual masking for some time. So you present a stimulus and then you present a mask over that. And in some paradigms, it would be perfect if the participant just could not see the first stimulus, so that you have perfect masking. And this is a pretty tricky job. And there are papers, a lot of papers, which then tell you, okay, we use that paradigm, and we had a detection rate of 0. People didn't see anything. And you take that paper and you program it exactly, you copy it in exactly the same way, sitting on the screen in front of the computer, and this first stimulus directly looks at you. You see it on every trial. You think, okay, what am I doing wrong? These are examples where a lot of fine-tuning is required. And so papers or methods, you are told or you've learned that you should write your methods part in a way that every researcher can fully replicate your study. So much detail should be given. However, still there may be differences. Maybe that they used a different screen than you used, that they have some different ambient lighting in the room can be sometimes of relevance. So don't be put off by such experiences. They are normal. So most paradigms are not that complicated and tricky, so you can just really set them up and they will work. But some of them are trickier than you may think in the beginning. Okay, just as a little aside here. Okay, I think it's the last of the executive tasks I would like to talk about, and then we can do a little break. And this is working memory span. And we already talked about working memory and said that basically it's the maintenance of task-related information during the performance of a cognitive task. So I do something, and at the same time I have to maintain information. And Randy Engel, quite active in this type of research as well, he wrote that working memory is a system consisting of those long-term memory traces active above threshold. And with this, he basically refers to short-term memory. The procedures and skills necessary to achieve and maintain that activation, and limited capacity controlled attention. That's the bit which is important in this context for us. So, in a very basic manner, you could say working memory basically is short-term memory plus controlled attention, and controlled attention is executive function. So a typical working memory span task looks as follows, and the first one is the reading span, or as Daneman and Carpenter developed that in the 1980s. So that's the first span task which has been published.